And I want to see a national health program that...
Next, on the 50s.
They took the country further than it seemed prepared to go.
The dreamers of a new society.
So that was Medicare. Medicare was then on its way.
Hello, I'm Holly Doan. You're watching The 50s, a special series on a remarkable decade in Canada. The role of government was turned upside down. For the first time in the 50s, Canadians looked to Ottawa to resolve the inequities of everyday life. It took an epidemic to do it. Watch now as we present the new society.
Summertime 1953. The country went to the lake. Only later would families remember it as a simple time. It did not seem simple then.
I don't have regrets. There are days when I kind of think it would have been nice to be a star left-handed pitcher and that kind of thing, but realistically, I don't have any regrets.
Canadians would not forget that summer of '53. It was the worst summer for an illness that frightened families and spread where crowds gathered. The epidemic struck 9,000 people that year, including children. It was polio.
We all knew, even at 7 years old, all kids in the city knew. We didn't do things in order to avoid contact with other kids which contributed to getting polio. I didn't go to the exhibition, for instance.
Survivors recalled the fear. The virus could strike any time. Polio destroyed nerve cells and muscles. 9 out of 10 patients recovered. Others never would. Polio sufferers were all ages, including the young and helpless.
My sister Blanche was doing her homework in the kitchen, and she had her on her knees, and when she stood up, she fell, and my mother thought that one of her legs had fallen asleep or something.
Claremont was a newspaperman and later Metro Toronto Police Commissioner.
The grocery man would deliver the groceries and he'd drop them out on the front sidewalk and then tear away. The milkman
wouldn't pick up the empty bottles. Milk bottles. He'd set the new milk bottles on the front steps, and it was a real panic.
Every summer was polio season. It was in summer the virus struck a 7-year-old boy from Windsor, Ontario. He was Paul Martin, Jr. His father, Paul, was federal health minister.
I came home one day and I remember having the feeling, I remember that today, of almost having a plate in my stomach, and I remember saying it to my mother. And the next thing I know, I was in the hospital. I mean, my mother, I think because of everybody knew about these summer epidemics, she just got me into the hospital, and thank heaven she did, because I'm not sure I'd be here today.
Young Paul Martin spent a year in recovery. His parents feared he'd be hospitalized for life. Children were terrorized by this machine. Polio victims, too weak to breathe, were placed in an artificial respirator, the iron lung. Patients might spend a week in the iron lung, or a month, or longer.
The boy next door, because there were about 30 of us, I don't remember, but I'm told subsequently there were about 30 of us in this one infirmary, pointing to an iron lung and saying, you're either not going to come out of here or you're going to be in one of those the rest of your life. And I remember him telling me that.
People rallied to fight polio. The March of Dimes raised a fortune for medical research, 10 cents at a time. Easter Seals put a child's face on its campaign against a disease that in time struck more than 50,000 Canadians. Each year they named an Easter Seal Timmy, a boy to help and inspire sick children. The 1958 Timmy was David Crocker, an Ontario schoolboy. He made public appearances with wrestler Whipper Billy Watson.
I think polio framed what my life was going to be like, and what I could do, what I couldn't do, I think it changed the person that I have become.
Polio was not defeated by charities alone. In its worst years, polio claimed more victims in Canada than tuberculosis. It would take a national effort. It cast the national government in a role it had never played in peacetime.
There were 5 other kids on my street who had polio that same year. Not all of them had paralytic polio, and so it wore off. But it was pretty common, pretty rampant.
Health Minister Paul Martin knew how rampant it was. Martin himself contracted polio in childhood and was scarred for life. He suffered muscle weakness and partial blindness in his left eye.
He came from a very poor family, and when you had something like polio, you were, you know, if you didn't come from privilege at that era, you were in for a very tough time, and I think he always knew that.
Martin was a grocer's son from Pembroke, Ontario. He'd been a mill hand who worked his way through Harvard Law School. Martin won his first election in 1935. He served 10 terms in Parliament under Mackenzie King and 2 other Liberal Prime Ministers, but said he'd never forget where he came from. Martin remembered his mother took him to Catholic shrines to pray for his recovery from polio. She believed in miracles, he said.
One day when we were in Montreal together, they said, let's go to Mass on Sunday at the oratory, and we did. He took me in behind the back part of the oratory where there are all of the crutches and everything else, and he said that my grandmother had taken him there.
Martin invited his mother when he was sworn to cabinet. He would advocate for government help for those in need. In his own party, Martin said, I could not count on vigorous support. Editor Clark Davey.
In a country that was, once you scraped away the Liberal Party logo, was inherently small c conservative.
The government was led by Louis Saint Laurent. In Ottawa, the Prime Minister set a leisurely pace by walking to work and back home for lunch. Reporter Bruce McDonald.
I couldn't believe it, so I went up at first place and I could turn, and drove back, and then came up beside him and I put down the window and I said, excuse me, Prime Minister, are you walking to work for pleasure, or could I give you a lift? Oh no, he says, no, it's fine, thank you very much.
Saint Laurent was 75. He proposed to stay in office into his 80s. A colleague said he suffered mental and physical fatigue that was serious for a man of his age.
Here, I'll tell you very frankly, you know, that I'm anxious to get away from this microphone and to get to a telephone to talk to my wife.
Friends charted Saint Laurent's decline from 1954. That winter, he became the first Prime Minister to go on a world tour.
He had a very long tour in Asia, and it went on for a very long time, and it really wore him out.
Saint Laurent's wife refused to fly. Most of the cabinet stayed home. Accompanied by staff and reporters, the Prime Minister embarked on an exhausting 5-week journey through 12 countries, from Indonesia to France. MP Paul Hellyer was an associate minister in the Saint Laurent cabinet.
It was a wonderful success diplomatically, but when he got back, he was just totally exhausted, and he fell into depression, and he was never really in charge of his cabinet again.
Canada's Prime Minister, Louis Saint Laurent, visits Paris. A smartly uniformed honor guard stands at attention at the tomb of the unknown soldier, where the Premier goes through the dignified ritual of placing a wreath, and almost puts out the eternal flame.
He was never the same. They didn't want to run in 1957, but the party agitators said they had to. It was a matter of letting the team down if he didn't, and he finally agreed. But he really didn't want to because he knew that it was going to be physically very, very hard on him, and it was.
Saint Laurent said Liberals must not start off in any new and strange direction. Paul Martin said later, the party leadership seemed to weigh him down. Years afterward, Saint Laurent was questioned on his inertia in office.
Many people then thought that you didn't take the leadership that you ought to have taken. You didn't say much.
Well, I perhaps did say as much as I should have said. People do make mistakes, you know.
Publicly, Martin advocated for pensions and public health insurance. Privately, he complained Saint Laurent was too timid. He would always try to water down government statements, he said. Historian Desmond Morgan.
Martin was a progressive force within the government, which was not a progressive force.
In 1952, Martin introduced Old Age Security, Canada's first universal pension. For years, pensioners were required to prove they had no private savings or property before applying for benefits. They called it the means test. Opposition MPs like Winnipeg Stanley Knowles of the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation advocated for pension reform.
Older people who have helped to make it possible to build up the country, unless they have had an 80% increase, they're still where they are.
It was terrifying to grow old because you knew what the fate of your parents had been. And their grandparents. They didn't live cheery, jolly lives visiting the grandchildren, chucking them on their knees. They lived in poverty. Desperate, starving, freezing poverty. Growing old was a horror.
For the first time, every citizen over 70 qualified for an old age pension. It was $40 a month, without a test.
If you are not receiving an old age pension and will be 70 years or over on January the 1st, do not delay. Apply now. You can get your application form at any post office. Just fill it in and mail it as soon as possible.
The first pension check was presented to George Wilde of Ottawa, a First War veteran and member of the Corps of Commissionaires, still on the job at 81. Martin delivered the check personally and wished Wilde a satisfying old age.
They took the country further than it seemed prepared to go, and then provided a foundation on which, you build old age security and a lot of other elements of the social welfare net that now are very comforting to people my age.
For those without a birth certificate, Martin said he'd accept family Bibles or heirlooms as proof of age. Canadians mailed in 8,600 Bibles to the Health and Welfare Minister, each book inscribed with family birth dates. By 1955, 750,000 retirees received the pension. Martin said, "We're advancing towards a fairer life than we've ever known."
And that struck a chord with Canadians who said, yeah, if we're going to have an old age pension, let's make sure it's enough.
There'll be a change in the weather and a change in the sea, and from now on there'll be a change in me. My walk will be different.
He was a bit of a show-off, and he was a bit of a sport. But he was likable as a human being, and I think he was a very basic kind of local politician.
I'll change the way that I've been strutting my stuff. Nobody wants you when you're old and gray. There'll be some changes made today. There'll be some changes made.
He came across a fellow, and he prided himself on knowing the names of so many people, and so he said, well, Bob, how are you, and how's your dad? And, well, Dad passed away.
Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. And then he went around, and he came around to
this fellow again, and he said, Bob, how will I see you?
How's your dad? Said he's still dead.
Nobody wants you when you're old and gray. There'll be some changes made today.
He and I would go around the riding together, and he would pick up hitchhikers to make sure that the hitchhiker knew that Paul Martin had picked him up, and would therefore go back and tell the family.
In 1955, medical researchers in the United States developed what was celebrated
as a scientific miracle. It was a polio vaccine named for Jonas Salk, the University of Pittsburgh researcher who created it.
Canada licensed the vaccine before American
lab tests were complete, on a hunch it would work. It did. Health Minister Martin ordered the medicine in production ahead of schedule. The newspaperman wrote, memories of his own childhood illness and of his sons were with him.
I think it's pretty tough on a parent to, it would have been pretty tough on a parent to deal with a kid who's at 7 years old or 10 years old or 3 years old, had his whole life in front of him or her. And part of it was stopped dead in its tracks.
Canada announced 1.5 million school children would be immunized before the polio season. In time, 5 million were vaccinated at public expense. The shots were free. Governments paid the cost. In 2 years, the incidence of polio fell 80%. Health Minister Martin said if government could do this, it could do more.
That was my father's philosophy, which was really the role of the state was to provide health care, was to provide education, was to provide these things that were going to basically provide equal opportunity or level the playing field.
I want to say immediately that we're not interested in a coalition.
Advocating for more initiatives was the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, the CCF. Its leader was an MP from Rosetown, Saskatchewan, Major James Coldwell.
Then, of course, there are the old age pensioners. We must do something better for them than the Liberal government proposed to do. And I want to see a national health program that will give to all our people an opportunity of good health and care when they are ill.
They were just ahead of their time, and they really
set the whole thought of this kind of policy in motion. But it takes time to people to come along to accept it.
New ideas.
Coldwell was a butcher's son.
He'd emigrated from England to teach school on the prairies and became a socialist, he said. Coldwell was elected a Regina alderman. He helped create the CCF in Depression years. He dreamed, he said, of the day when a new world may be born.
His daughter, Margaret.
I know that he was accused of being a communist once by, I think it was Premier of Ontario. And that was the one time that I know he got very angry.
Coldwell campaigned in post-war years, saying, "We live in one of those great revolutionary periods of human history." In its literature, the party proposed to create a socialized health service with care for all citizens.
The Liberals promised Medicare in 1945 because the CCF had promised it. They didn't deliver,
of course, until the CCF could manage to do it in one of Canada's poorest provinces, Saskatchewan.
Saskatchewan, in 1944, elected the country's only CCF government. In its first term, it introduced provincial hospital insurance. From 1947, the Hospital Services Program promised basic care at public expense with a user fee, $5 a year.
A message from Premier T.C. Douglas. Mr. Douglas.
On January 1st, the people of Saskatchewan and their government will take a forward step toward greater social security. I believe that the people of Saskatchewan are determined to make it a grand success, not only because we need it and want it, but because it will set the pattern for other social security measures, both here in Saskatchewan and elsewhere in Canada.
My father was very close to a number of the CCF members, and when my father wanted to push things in the House, certainly in terms of health insurance and that kind of thing, it would not be totally unusual that he would convince one of his CCF members opposite one of his friends to ask him a question in the House, and then he would go into cabinet and say, "You see, I'm getting pressure from the opposition. We've got to move here."
Most Canadians in the early 1950s bought private medical insurance at their own cost. CCF speakers and supporters in Canada's largest trade unions proposed a national health plan.
Labor's Own Day is the first Monday in September. Toronto trade unionists march in the largest Labor Day parade on the North American continent.
With demands for a guaranteed annual wage, trade union locals in Canada campaigned for a whole program of social benefits, pensions, and public insurance.
A legal holiday in Canada since 1894, the Labor Day show gets bigger and better every year.
Polls showed 72%
Canadians favored a public hospital insurance plan paid by taxes. The party that pioneered the idea, Coldwell CCF, lost 7 national elections in a row. It remained a third party in the House of Commons. Remembering Coldwell years later, Paul Martin wrote he could have become a good member of cabinet or even prime minister if he had been a Liberal.
The Liberal Party used a lot of our ideas, I believe. But my father never wanted to be, I know they asked him to be involved in their party, but he never wanted to be. He wanted to achieve his purpose through democratic socialism.
We've never been the government of Canada, but I think we've had a remarkable influence, for good, in the Parliament and across the country.
He was my hero, of course. We were very close, my father and I.
In studying CCF proposals for public health insurance, Saint Laurent at first was cautious. He said, "We don't want to make promises." Later, once out of office, Saint Laurent expressed admiration for the CCF and its leader.
What did you think of Mr. Coldwell?
Well, I thought that it was rather unfortunate that he wasn't a member of our party.
There were huge fights because the Minister of Finance at the time said we can't afford it. We don't want to do it. That was the huge fight. And then, of course, in 1957, when my father was able to bring in health insurance, which he had fought for 10 years, it took him that long to get it going. Well, that was Medicare. That was Medicare. Medicare was then on its way.
Canada, for the first time, offered subsidized care. Hospital services were government insured and cost shared with any province that wanted to sign up. Patients were charged user fees, $1 a day in British Columbia, $2 in Alberta, $3 in Nova Scotia. By 1959, every province but Quebec had introduced public hospital insurance. The legislation was Paul Martin's, the boy who'd been stricken with polio. Canadians know, he said, Social Security for the people comes from the people. No health and welfare minister had introduced so many reforms. He received little reward for it.
Paul Martin Sr., I think, basically his problem, he was seen as being too partisan, too opportunistic in his own interests.
I do not deny I'm a politician, Martin said. There's nothing sinister about it. Campaigning for the Liberal leadership in 1958, Martin lost with 22% support. He told friends, if you want to know what real loneliness is, become a politician and then lose an election.
He was an excellent minister, but the Liberal Party didn't want him as a leader. And I think he got to know that. I think he was sad about it.
Well, I remember my mother telling me that she was told by the doctor after I had begun to recover that the doctor said, you can't upset him. You can't upset his nervous system. And one day I was playing baseball, and I had my favorite baseball and had no cover on it, and I lost it. And I apparently came home and I was really upset. I'd lost my favorite baseball. My gosh, this was awful. And the next day I came home and there was my baseball just in front of the house with the cover off it. And I learned many years later that what had happened is my mother went out and got a baseball, took the cover off and put it there.
Thank you.